Why were historians silent when enlarging the boy's hand in this 1854 portrait? The photograph arrived at Thomas Harper's office on a cold February morning in 2024, delivered by courier in a plain brown package. Thomas, a curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, had examined thousands of historical images during his 20-year career, but something about this one made him stop breathing for a moment. The image showed a wealthy family posed before an impressive mansion circa 1854. The architecture was unmistakable, Greek Revival style with tall white columns that spoke of Southern prosperity. 5 people dominated the foreground: a stern father in a dark suit, his hand resting on an ornate chair, a mother in elaborate silk with layers of crinolines, and 3 children arranged between them, all dressed in their finest clothes, faces serious in the formal way people posed for daguerreotypes. But it wasn't the family that captured Thomas's attention. In the background, partially obscured by morning light filtering through the columns, were 2 smaller figures. Children sitting on the ground behind the posed family, almost invisible in the composition. Thomas adjusted his examination lamp and leaned closer, his pulse quickening. One child was white, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with light hair catching the sun. The other was black, roughly the same age, sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. They appeared to be playing with something on the ground between them, oblivious to the formal portrait being captured just feet away. Thomas had studied hundreds of antebellum photographs. He knew how these images were composed, how enslaved people were positioned when they appeared at all, usually standing rigidly at edges, clearly marked as property. But this was different. These children were playing together, interacting as equals, their body language suggesting comfort and familiarity rather than the rigid hierarchy that defined Southern society in 1854. Dr. Harper, his assistant Rebecca, appeared with coffee. The donor note says it came from an estate in Charleston, South Carolina, a family clearing out a property that's been theirs since before the Civil War, found boxes of photographs in the attic. Thomas accepted the coffee without looking away. Any documentation? Letters? Diaries? Anything identifying these people? Rebecca handed him a small tin box. Inside were folded letters, a leather journal, and paper with names in faded ink. The Harrison family, 1854. Edward Harrison, Sarah Harrison, Edward Jr., William, Margaret, Samuel, and Joseph. 7 names. The photograph showed 5 in formal pose, 2 in background. Thomas counted again. Edward and Sarah were the parents. Edward Jr., William, and Margaret, the 3 posed children. That left Samuel and Joseph. He looked at the playing boys. One was a Harrison child, the other was enslaved. But which name belonged to which child? Thomas turned the photograph over. A pencil inscription, barely visible. Sam and Joseph, summer 1854, forever friends. His hands trembled. This wasn't just a family portrait. It was documentation of something forbidden, friendship between a white child and an enslaved child, preserved by someone who had carefully labeled it. The question was why, and what had happened to these boys whose bond had been captured in this fragile moment. Thomas spent 3 days examining every detail using the museum's advanced imaging technology. He scanned at high resolution, adjusted contrast and brightness, used specialized software to enhance faded areas. The results were remarkable and deeply unsettling. The white boy in the background, presumably Samuel Harrison, the 4th son not posed with the formal family, wore simple clothes compared to his siblings' finery. His shirt was clean but plain, trousers rolled at the ankles, and he was barefoot. His hair was disheveled from hours of play. His profile showed concentration and what might have been joy. The black boy beside him, Joseph, wore even simpler clothing, rough cotton that marked him unmistakably as enslaved. But his posture struck Thomas forcefully. He wasn't crouched in deference or positioned to show subservience. He sat exactly as Samuel sat, bodies mirroring each other in a way suggesting deep familiarity and equality, at least in that moment. Between them on the ground were several small objects. Thomas enhanced that area repeatedly, trying to identify what they were playing with. After hours of work, he made out carved wooden soldiers, arranged in formation as if engaged in battle. The boys were playing war games together, sharing toys, creating imaginary worlds the way children had done for centuries. But examining the boy's hands made Thomas's breath catch. He zoomed in on Joseph's right hand, the one closest to Samuel, increasing resolution until individual pixels became visible. There, on Joseph's small hand, was something that shouldn't have been there. A scar, distinctive and deliberate, running across his palm in a pattern clearly not accidental. Thomas had seen enough documents from the antebellum South to recognize what he was looking at. A brand, a mark of ownership, applied to enslaved people the way livestock were marked. But this brand was on a child's hand, a boy who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. The casual cruelty of branding a small child made Thomas's stomach turn. He sat back, processing what he had discovered. This photograph documented something horrific and something tender existing side by side. 2 boys playing together as friends, while one bore the physical mark of being considered property. The juxtaposition was almost unbearable. Rebecca entered carrying census records and property documents. "I found the Harrison family in the 1850 census," she said, spreading papers on Thomas's desk. "Edward Harrison owned a plantation called Riverside, about 15 miles outside Charleston. He's listed as owning 47 enslaved people in 1850, 62 by 1860. Thomas scanned the documents. The 1850 census listed enslaved people only by age and gender, not names. They weren't considered worthy of individual identification. But the 1860 census included a slave schedule. Thomas ran his finger down the age list, looking for someone around 7 or 8 in 1854. There. Listed as number 23. Male, age 13 in 1860. Field hand. That would make him 7 in 1854. No name, just a number and age. This could be Joseph, reduced to a line in a government document, his friendship with Samuel invisible in official records. "There's something else," Rebecca said quietly. "I found a Charleston newspaper reference from 1856. Society column about a party at Riverside Plantation. Mentions Edward and Sarah Harrison and their 3 children attending a Christmas ball. 3 children, not 4. Thomas looked up sharply. "Samuel isn't mentioned?" "No, and I checked other mentions from that period. The family is always described as having 3 children. Samuel's name never appears after 1854. The leather journal Thomas found in the tin box belonged to Sarah Harrison, the mother in the photograph. Her handwriting was elegant and controlled, the product of expensive education. Her entries covered 1852 to 1858. Thomas read methodically, searching for mentions of Samuel or Joseph. Early entries were mundane: parties, weather, notes about children's progress. Sarah wrote about Edward Jr., his aptitude for mathematics, William's love of horses, Margaret's skill at piano. But Samuel's name appeared less frequently, and the tone was different. March 18th, 1853. Samuel continues to resist his tutors. He shows no interest in the classics or proper comportment. Edward is growing impatient. I fear Samuel will never learn to take his place in society as his brothers will. July 4th, 1853. I found Samuel playing with the servants' children again. I have spoken to him repeatedly about maintaining proper distance, but he does not listen. Edward says I am too lenient. Perhaps he is right. Thomas saw a picture forming. Samuel was different from his siblings, unwilling or unable to conform to rigid expectations. His parents viewed this as failure, a source of shame rather than simply different temperament. Entries about Joseph began appearing in 1854, though Sarah never used his name, only the boy, or the child from the quarters. April 12th, 1854. Samuel has formed an attachment to one of the younger slaves, the boy Joseph we acquired last year. They spend hours together, and I confess I have allowed it because it keeps Samuel occupied and out of Edward's notice. The boy seems intelligent for his kind, and Samuel appears happy in his company. I tell myself it is harmless, though I know Edward would disapprove if he paid attention. Thomas noted the date, April 1854, months before the photograph. Sarah's tone suggested both awareness that the friendship was transgressive and willingness to overlook it for convenience. She was more concerned with keeping Samuel out of his father's way than enforcing racial boundaries. Entries continued through spring and summer 1854, documenting a deepening friendship Sarah observed with mixture of bemusement and concern. June 3rd, 1854. I watched Samuel and the boy playing by the creek this morning. They have built some sort of fort from branches, and are engaged in elaborate games of soldiers and battles. Samuel insists the boy is his best friend, his only real friend. He says his brothers are mean and don't understand him. I did not know what to say. How does one explain to a 7-year-old child that friendship across such lines is impossible? Thomas read that passage 3 times. Sarah had been aware her son was forming genuine emotional bond with an enslaved child, troubled not because she thought it morally wrong, but because she knew it was socially impossible. Their society had no category for such friendship, no way to accommodate it as the boys grew older. August 15th, 1854. The photographer came today for a family portrait. Edward insisted we dress in our finest. I tried to keep Samuel clean and properly dressed, but he slipped away during preparations and came back with dirt on his clothes and the boy Joseph with him. They had been playing, and Samuel refused to send him away. The photographer seemed uncomfortable, but proceeded. I saw them in the background as the image was taken, still playing their games, oblivious to the formality occurring just feet away. Edward did not notice, being focused on presenting proper image. I wonder what future generations will think. A proper family portrait with 2 children playing in the background, one white and one Negro, as if such friendships were natural. Perhaps in some distant future they will be, but not in ours. The tone of Sarah's journal shifted dramatically in September 1854, weeks after the photograph. The change was subtle at first, but Thomas recognized it. The careful handwriting became more hurried, entries more emotional and less composed. September 7th, 1854. Edward has finally noticed Samuel's attachment to the boy. He came upon them today in the library, where Samuel was teaching Joseph his letters from a primer. Edward was furious. He struck Samuel and forbade him from speaking to the boy again. Samuel wept and said Joseph was his friend, that friends help each other learn. Edward said slaves are not friends, they are property, and Samuel must learn this truth or face consequences. I tried to intervene, but Edward would not hear me. Thomas felt his chest tighten. The friendship had been discovered, and Edward Harrison's reaction was swift and violent. The image of a 7-year-old being struck for teaching his friend to read was painful, but entirely consistent with slavery's brutal logic. Literacy was dangerous for enslaved people, a pathway to freedom and resistance. By teaching Joseph, Samuel was undermining the entire system his family's wealth depended on. September 12, 1854. Samuel has been confined to his room for 5 days. He's allowed out only for meals, which he takes in silence, his eyes red from crying. Edward has ordered all house slaves to refuse any requests Samuel makes, and to report immediately if he tries to communicate with Joseph. I am permitted to visit him, but Edward watches me closely, suspecting I am too sympathetic. Samuel asked me today why Joseph couldn't be his friend. How do I explain to my child that the world we live in forbids love across the color line? How do I make him understand that kindness and friendship are luxuries we cannot afford when they threaten social order? The next entry was dated 2 weeks later, Sarah's handwriting shaky as if written in distress. September 28, 1854. Edward has made a decision that breaks my heart, though I cannot say I did not see it coming. He has sold the boy Joseph to a slave trader bound for New Orleans. He says the boy is a bad influence, that he encouraged Samuel's willfulness and disobedience. The truth is, Edward cannot tolerate any challenge to his authority, and Samuel's attachment to Joseph represented exactly that. The boy was taken this morning while Samuel was at his lessons. Samuel does not yet know. I dread telling him. Thomas had to stop reading. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at Washington streets below, trying to steady his breathing. A child had been sold and separated from everything he knew because his friendship with a white child was considered dangerous. Joseph had been torn away, not because he had done anything wrong, but because their bond threatened the racial hierarchy Edward Harrison needed to maintain. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, reading Thomas's expression with concern. "Are you all right?" "They sold him," Thomas said, voice rough. "Edward Harrison sold Joseph because Samuel cared about him. A 7-year-old child was sold away from everything he knew because he was someone's friend." Rebecca's face paled. "Does the journal say what happened when Samuel found out?" Thomas returned to his desk and continued reading, though part of him didn't want to know. September 29th, 1854. I told Samuel this morning that Joseph was gone, sold to a trader headed south. Samuel became hysterical. He screamed that it wasn't fair, that Joseph was his friend, that we had to get him back. He tried to run from the house, saying he would find Joseph and bring him home. Edward caught him and locked him in the cellar. I can hear Samuel crying even now, hours later. He keeps calling Joseph's name. My heart is breaking, but Edward says this is necessary, that Samuel must learn his place and accept the natural order of things. I am not certain my son will ever forgive us for this. The journal entries following Joseph's sale documented Samuel's deterioration with a mother's anguished precision. Sarah Harrison wrote about her son's transformation from a spirited, affectionate child to someone silent and withdrawn, someone disappearing from the inside out. October 15th, 1854. Samuel has stopped speaking almost entirely. He takes meals in silence, completes lessons mechanically, and spends hours staring out the window toward the slave quarters as if hoping Joseph will somehow reappear. His tutor reports Samuel shows no interest in studies and seems present only in body. Edward insists this is temporary, that children forget quickly, that Samuel will soon adjust and forget the boy. I am not so certain. I see something in Samuel's eyes that frightens me, a coldness, a distance, as if he has gone somewhere we cannot reach him. Thomas cross-referenced these entries with other documents Rebecca found. She had located records from a private Charleston school where the Harrison boys enrolled in 1855. Edward Jr. and William appeared on honor rolls and in accounts of school performances. Samuel's name appeared only on enrollment lists, with a note from the headmaster. Adequate performance, but the boy shows little interest in forming friendships with peers, prefers solitude to society. November 8th, 1854. I found Samuel in the library today, looking at the photograph taken this summer. He was tracing his finger over the image of the 2 boys in the background. When he saw me, he asked if I remembered that day, if I remembered how happy he had been. I said I did. He asked if Joseph was happy wherever he was now. I could not lie to my child. I said I did not know, but I hoped so. Samuel said, "He's not happy, Mother. He can't be happy without his friend, just like I can't be happy without mine." Then he asked me a question that has haunted me since. If we're supposed to be good Christians, why did Father do something so cruel? I had no answer. Winter 1854 to 1855 brought more troubling observations. Samuel began having nightmares, waking the household with screams. Sarah wrote that he dreamed Joseph was calling for him, asking why Samuel had let him be taken. Edward's response was to move Samuel to a room in a different part of the house, far from his parents and siblings, where his disturbances wouldn't bother anyone. January 20th, 1855. Samuel has begun refusing to eat. He takes a few bites when forced, but otherwise shows no interest in food. He has grown thin and pale. Our doctor examined him and found no physical illness. He suggested Samuel is suffering from melancholia, what he called a disorder of the spirit. He recommended exercise, fresh air, and stern discipline to shake Samuel from his gloom. Edward has taken this advice to heart and insists Samuel spend hours each day riding with his brothers. But Samuel seems to take no joy in it. He participates mechanically, doing what is required, but showing no life, no spark. By spring 1855, Sarah's entries showed mounting desperation. She had begun consulting other doctors, trying different treatments, searching for something that would bring her son back from wherever he had gone. But the pattern was clear to Thomas. Reading 170 years later, Samuel was experiencing what we would now recognize as severe depression and trauma, brought on by forced separation from his friend and by his family's refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of his grief. April 3rd, 1855. I asked Edward today if there was any way to locate Joseph, to perhaps purchase him back. Edward was furious. He said I was encouraging Samuel's weakness, that the boy needed to learn his lesson, not be coddled. He forbade me from ever mentioning Joseph's name again. He said if I continued to indulge Samuel's attachment to a slave, he would send Samuel away to military academy where such foolishness would be beaten out of him. Thomas needed to find out what happened to Joseph after he was sold. He contacted colleagues who specialized in slave trade records, databases tracking the buying and selling of human beings in the antebellum South. The work was painstaking and often incomplete. Many records had been destroyed or were deliberately vague about individual enslaved people, but Thomas got lucky. A historian at Tulane University had digitized records from a major slave trading firm that operated out of New Orleans in the 1850s. The firm's ledgers were remarkably detailed, recording not just ages and genders, but sometimes names and physical descriptions. In a ledger dated October 1854, Thomas found an entry that made his hands shake. Boy, age approx. 8 years. Name given as Joseph, purchased from E. Harrison, Charleston, SC. Light scarring on right palm. Sold to sugar plantation, Bayou Teche, Louisiana. Price, $650. $650. That was what Joseph's life had been worth to Edward Harrison, a sum that would cover perhaps 2 months of household expenses for a wealthy planter family. A child's friendship, a child's future, sold for less than the cost of a good horse. Thomas contacted archives in Louisiana, searching for records of the sugar plantation where Joseph had been sent. Sugar plantations were notoriously brutal, with mortality rates higher than almost any other form of enslaved labor. The work was backbreaking, hours were endless, and overseers were known for their cruelty. Sending an 8-year-old child there was essentially a death sentence, just a slower one than a bullet. He found a partial inventory from 1856 for a plantation owned by Jacques Beaumont in St. Mary Parish, Louisiana. Listed among enslaved workers was Joseph, field hand, age approx. 10 years. The boy had survived at least 2 years in conditions that killed many adults, but there was no record after 1856. Plantation records became spotty during the late 1850s, and many documents were lost during the Civil War. Meanwhile, Thomas continued reading Sarah Harrison's journal, watching her document Samuel's continued decline through 1855 and 1856. Her entries became shorter, more clinical, as if she was trying to distance herself emotionally from her son's suffering. But June 12, 1855. Samuel's tutor has given up on him. He says the boy is unteachable, that he sits through lessons but retains nothing. Edward has decided to send Samuel to military school in Virginia in the fall. He believes military discipline will cure what he calls Samuel's weakness of character. September 30th, 1855. Samuel left for military school today. He did not speak during the carriage ride to the station. He did not embrace his siblings when saying goodbye. He looked at me once before boarding the train, and I saw in his eyes nothing but emptiness. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that I wished things could be different, but the words caught in my throat. Edward stood beside me, stern and satisfied, believing he is doing what is best for his son. I fear we have already lost Samuel, that we lost him the day we sold Joseph. Thomas found records from Virginia Military Institute showing Samuel Harrison enrolled in fall 1855. The school's disciplinary records showed multiple incidents. Samuel refusing to follow orders, Samuel found sleeping during the day, Samuel involved in a fight with another cadet who had made disparaging remarks about the inferior races. Each incident resulted in punishment, extra duties, confinement, physical discipline. Nothing changed Samuel's behavior. In March 1856, the school sent a letter to Edward Harrison, preserved in the family papers. The headmaster wrote that Samuel was unsuitable for military life and showed a dangerous sympathy for Negro slaves that interferes with his ability to accept proper authority. The school recommended Samuel be withdrawn. Sarah's journal entry from March 1856 was brief and devastating. Samuel has been expelled from military school. Edward is furious and has declared Samuel a disgrace to the family name. He says Samuel will not be welcome in Charleston society, that he has embarrassed us beyond repair. Samuel is to live at Riverside, but is not to attend family functions or appear in public with us. As far as Charleston is concerned, Edward and I now have only 3 children. This explained why newspaper accounts after 1856 never mentioned Samuel. He had been effectively erased from the family's public identity, hidden away like a shameful secret. A 9-year-old child had been cast out of his own family because he couldn't forget his friend, couldn't accept that Joseph's humanity didn't matter. The later entries in Sarah Harrison's journal became increasingly sparse. She wrote less frequently, and when she did, her words were careful, emotionally distant, as if writing for an audience rather than for herself. But between the lines, Thomas could read her guilt and sorrow. December 25th, 1856. Christmas at Riverside. Edward Jr. William and Margaret opened their gifts with appropriate joy. The house was full of guests, laughter, music. Samuel remained in his room. I brought him a plate of food and found him sitting by the window, looking toward the old oak tree where he and Joseph used to play. He is 10 years old today. I had almost forgotten. He said nothing when I wished him happy birthday. I left the food and closed the door. I could not bear to stay. Thomas cross-referenced this entry with financial records Rebecca had found in Charleston County archives. In January 1857, Edward Harrison made a significant purchase, a property in the rural outskirts of the county, a small farmhouse with 20 acres. The deed listed the purpose as agricultural use, but Thomas suspected its real purpose was to remove Samuel even further from the family's daily life. February 14th, 1857. Edward has decided to send Samuel to live at the new property. He will be supervised by an overseer and expected to work the land. Edward says manual labor will cure Samuel's defects of character. I argued that Samuel is only 10 years old, that he should be in school, but Edward would not listen. He says Samuel has proven himself incapable of education or proper society. I am losing my son piece by piece, and I am powerless to stop it. Journal entries after this became rare, sometimes months apart. Sarah wrote about her other children's accomplishments, social events, daily management of Riverside Plantation. Samuel's name appeared less frequently, and when it did, mentions were brief and pained. August 3rd, 1858. I visited Samuel today at the farm. I had not seen him in 6 months. He has grown tall but thin, all angles and bones. His hands are calloused from work. He was polite but distant, as if I were a stranger. I tried to talk to him about his life, his days, but he answered in monosyllables. Finally, I asked if he was happy. He looked at me with eyes much older than 11 years should be and said, "I stopped being happy 4 years ago, Mother. I stopped being happy the day you let Father sell Joseph." I had no response. This was the last entry mentioning Samuel directly. The final pages covered 1858 and early 1859, mostly mundane observations about weather and household matters. Then entries stopped abruptly in March 1859, mid-sentence, as if Sarah had simply put down her pen and never picked it up again. Thomas searched for records of what happened to Sarah Harrison after 1859. He found her death certificate in Charleston archives. Sarah Harrison died April 15, 1859, age 41. Cause of death listed as fever. But Thomas had read enough 19th century medical records to know that fever was often euphemism for illnesses families didn't want to name publicly. Sometimes tuberculosis, sometimes other chronic conditions, sometimes simply giving up the will to live. He wondered if Sarah had died of grief, of accumulated weight of watching her son suffer while being unable or unwilling to challenge the system causing that suffering. She had documented Samuel's destruction in her journal, had seen clearly what Joseph's loss had done to him, but she had chosen to preserve her marriage and social position rather than fight for her child's happiness. But what had happened to Samuel after his mother's death? Thomas returned to county records, searching through deeds, tax documents, and court papers. He found something unexpected. In 1860, when Samuel would have been 13, the farm property was sold. The buyer was listed as William Harrison, guardian for Samuel Harrison, minor. William was Samuel's older brother, the second son, who would have been about 17 in 1860. Somehow Samuel had come back under family control, but not his father's. Edward Harrison's name appeared nowhere in the transaction. Thomas searched probate records and found the answer, Edward Harrison had died in February 1860, just months after his wife, cause of death listed as apoplexy, most likely a stroke. With both parents dead, the family property and guardianship of younger children fell to Edward Jr., who was 20. But records showed Edward Jr. had immediately transferred guardianship of Samuel to William, while retaining guardianship of their sister Margaret. Thomas found crucial information in Civil War military records. When war broke out in 1861, thousands of young Southern men enlisted in Confederate forces. Thomas searched for the Harrison brothers and found both Edward Jr. and William listed as officers in South Carolina regiments. But there was a third Harrison name Thomas hadn't expected, Samuel Harrison, enlisted as a private in the 1st South Carolina Infantry in June 1861. He would have been only 14, far below official enlistment age, but age requirements were often overlooked in war mobilization chaos, especially for boys from prominent families. What was remarkable was Samuel's service record. Unlike his brothers, who served in cavalry units appropriate to their social status, Samuel had enlisted in a regular infantry regiment composed primarily of non-slaveholding white men and poor farmers. His record contained a notation Thomas found shocking. Assigned to medical corps as assistant to regimental surgeon, demonstrated unusual aptitude for caring for wounded without regard to rank or circumstances. Thomas contacted a colleague who specialized in Civil War medical history. She explained that medical assistants often worked closely with wounded and dying soldiers from both sides, and this work was considered low status and unpleasant, something gentlemen officers avoided. Samuel volunteering for this duty suggested something about his character, about who he had become. The colleague sent Thomas copies of letters written by the regimental surgeon, Dr. Marcus Webb, preserved in South Carolina archives. In a letter dated September 1862, Dr. Webb wrote to a medical colleague, "I have with me a boy named Samuel Harrison, who claims to be 16 but looks younger. He came requesting to help with the wounded, and I initially refused, thinking him too young and soft. But he persisted, and I finally agreed. I have since learned this boy has rare gift for medicine and even rarer capacity for compassion. He works tirelessly, holding water to their lips, dressing wounds, sitting with them as they die. What is most remarkable is that he shows no distinction in his care. He tends to privates with same attention he gives officers." Dr. Webb's letter continued, "He has been known to offer comfort to wounded Negro soldiers we have captured, speaking to them with kindness and respect that others find inappropriate. When I asked him why he does this, he said simply that suffering does not distinguish between conditions of birth. I believe this boy has seen something in his young life that has given him wisdom beyond his years." Thomas felt tears prickling his eyes. Samuel, scarred by loss of his friend, and years of punishment for caring across racial lines, had found a way to continue caring despite everything. He had found a place where his compassion could be useful, even if others found it inappropriate. Military records showed Samuel served with the 1st South Carolina Infantry until the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, one of the bloodiest single days of the Civil War. The battle resulted in over 22,000 casualties, and Samuel's regiment was heavily engaged. In the aftermath, Samuel was listed among wounded, with notation, "Severe injury to right arm, sent to hospital in Richmond." Thomas found hospital records from Richmond confirming Samuel had been treated for a gunshot wound that shattered his right arm. Surgeons had wanted to amputate, but Samuel refused, insisting they try to save the limb. He survived, though records noted he would likely never regain full use of his arm. What happened after his injury took months to piece together. Hospital records showed he was discharged from military service in November 1862, deemed unfit for combat duty. But unlike most discharged soldiers who returned home, Samuel didn't go back to Charleston. Thomas found his name on a passenger list for a ship traveling from Richmond to Philadelphia in December 1862. Samuel Harrison, at age 15, had left the Confederacy and headed north. He had walked away from his family, his home, everything he had known, and crossed into Union territory. This was desertion in Confederate eyes, betrayal of his class and region. But Samuel had done it anyway, choosing exile over returning to a place that had destroyed his childhood and his friendship with Joseph. Finding Samuel's trail in the north proved difficult. The name was common, and many Civil War records were incomplete. But Thomas had one crucial detail, the injured right arm, which would have made Samuel distinctive. Thomas found a breakthrough in Philadelphia Quaker archives. The Religious Society of Friends had been active in helping refugees from the South, including wounded soldiers who had become disillusioned with the Confederate cause. In their records from January 1863, Thomas found a note about a young man named Samuel. A youth of perhaps 16 years came to our meeting house today, having traveled from Richmond. He is wounded in his right arm and appears malnourished and exhausted. He says he can no longer fight for a cause he does not believe in, that he has seen too much death and suffering. We have taken him into our community and will help him recover his health. He seems particularly interested in our work, teaching freed slaves to read and write. He says he once had a friend who was a slave. and he wishes to honor that friendship by helping others gain freedom through education. The Quakers gave Samuel refuge, and in return, Samuel found his purpose. Thomas discovered records showing Samuel worked with various freedmen's aid societies throughout the war, teaching literacy and basic medicine to formerly enslaved people who had escaped to Union territory. In 1868, Samuel appeared in records of a teacher training school in Washington that prepared black educators. He was listed as an instructor, teaching reading methods and basic medicine. At 21, Samuel was training teachers who would educate children of people who had once been enslaved. But it was a letter from 1870 that brought Thomas closest to tears. The letter was written by Samuel to the Freedmen's Bureau. I am searching for a man who would now be approximately 24 years old. His name is Joseph, and he was sold from Charleston, South Carolina, to a sugar plantation in Louisiana in 1854. He had a scar on his right palm from a brand. He was my closest friend as a child, and we were separated when we were both 7 years old. I have spent the last 8 years working to help free and educate formerly enslaved people, but I have never stopped hoping I might find him alive. Thomas searched through Freedmen's Bureau records, but found no response to Samuel's letter. Samuel never married, never had children. He dedicated his entire adult life to education and advocacy, working tirelessly until his death in 1891 at age 44 from pneumonia. Thomas presented his findings at the Organization of American Historians Conference in April 2025. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity. He displayed the 1854 photograph on the large screen. The Harrison family posed formally, and in the background, two small boys playing together, their friendship captured before it was violently destroyed. This photograph documents something the historical record tried to erase, Thomas began. It shows friendship between a white child and an enslaved child, a relationship considered impossible and dangerous. The friendship captured here led to Samuel Harrison's childhood destruction, to his exile from his family, and ultimately to his life's work, fighting the system that had taken his friend away. After the presentation, an elderly man introduced himself as Robert Washington, a retired teacher from Louisiana. My great-great-grandfather was named Joseph, Robert said, hands trembling as he held an old photograph. He survived a Louisiana sugar plantation and became a teacher. He used to tell my grandfather about a white boy who had taught him his letters and had been kind to him when he was 7. Robert showed Thomas the photograph of an elderly black man standing before a schoolhouse. On the back, Joseph Washington, teacher, 1895, in memory of a friend who showed me letters and kindness when I was 7 years old. Thomas's hands shook. The timeline matched perfectly. I think he survived, Thomas said quietly. And I think he remembered Samuel the same way Samuel remembered him. They never found each other again, but they both became teachers. Both dedicated themselves to helping others. They carried their friendship forward even when they couldn't carry it together. The photograph of Samuel and Joseph was later donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The exhibition label read, "This photograph captures a friendship that was not supposed to exist but did. The two boys were separated by slavery, but their brief connection shaped both their lives and the lives of countless others they touched through their work as educators. Visitors continued to come to see Samuel and Joseph, to learn their story and to carry forward the lesson they had taught, that human connection matters more than the boundaries society tries to impose, and that the courage to love across those boundaries can change everything.